Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the 10-minute chart of crude oil provided by netdata.com. You can click on the link below. Now, we had this interesting gap up opening on a crude oil, and normally when you get those types of gaps, you're looking at some sort of resistance level that has been broken through. Now, when we pull out on the charts, we really, you'd expect to be seeing this level here corresponding here, something like this, that we'd be jumping through. But you can see as we push out, we really don't find a corresponding price. So I usually don't attribute breakout or gap moves to trend line resistance, because trend line resistance isn't real resistance because it's not at the price. But if we draw this trend line here, let's try to draw this carefully. If we draw it just carefully enough, we get some information here. So if we draw that trend line and then we zoom back into the 5-minute, and the trend line will stay intact, we can see that this breakout was right to that long, very long-term trend line. So I'm starting to think there may be some relationship with this gap breakout that we had and this long-term trend line. Is this related to the potential war that is brewing in the Middle East? Possibly. You can see this is a very large 4-year pennant formation that is forming. So it's quite possible that we could get a move like this. I'm not saying we will get that, but it is quite possible. It's possible that with the breakout of some type of conflict, we could get a quick move of $25 or $30 in the price of oil. Something similar to what we saw back during the first Gulf War. I think we saw a very large percentage spike and then a calming down after the results were more easily predicted. So that's what we're looking at with oil. The silver chart is basically dead and just nothing going on, just a time for stacking, and the gold chart as well is just kind of dead. So not a lot going on in gold and silver. So I wanted to jump over to the main topic of the night. This is really the only thing I'm going to cover tonight. It's on the occasion of an anniversary printing on 24-hour gold of an article by Antal E. Fekete, who, if you haven't heard of him, is a very renowned economist and mathematician. I'm going to go over just briefly his Wikipedia entry here. He's a professor of mathematics, and he was born in 1932. This has obviously been around for a long time. His original profession is as a mathematician, but he is an autodidactic monetary economist, which just means that he's self-taught. So he has some interesting opinions that don't really match with traditional von Mises Austrians, and but there's no doubt his brilliance. He has this doctrine of the real bills doctrine, and I don't have time to go into that here, and also the hexagonal model of capital formation interest. So very complex economic theories. He's come at odds with some of the Rothbardian and some of the von Mises people, but he definitely has a monumental contribution. So I wanted to review this article on silver and opium. This is actually the first time I've read this article, and I was so blown away by his analysis. I just decided I'm going to read this whole thing, and then we'll go into some commentary about it. The Opium Wars do not belong to the glorious episodes of Western history. Rather, they were instances of shameful behavior the West still has not lived down. Mercantilist governments resented the perpetual drain of silver from west to east in payment for Oriental goods, tea, silk, porcelain. that were in high demand in the Occident, facing low demand in the Orient for Occidental goods. Does that sound familiar? From the mid-17th century, more than 9 billion troy ounces, or 290,000 metric tons of silver, was absorbed by China from European countries in exchange for Chinese goods. The British introduced opium along with tobacco as an export item to China in order to reduce their trade deficit. Under the guise of free trade, the British, the Spanish, and the French, with the tacit approval of the Americans, continued sending their contraband to China through legitimate as well as illegitimate trade channels, even after the Chinese dynasty put an embargo on opium imports. Because of its strong appeal to the Chinese masses and because of its highly addictive nature, opium appeared to be the ideal solution to the West's trade problem. And indeed, the flow of silver was first stopped and then reversed. China was forced to pay silver for her addiction to opium smoking that was artificially induced by the pusher, the British. Thus, silver was replaced by opium as the mainstay of Western exports. In 1729, China, recognizing the growing problem of addiction and the debilitating and mind-corrupting nature of the drug, prohibited the sale and smoking of opium, allowing only a small quota of imports for medicinal purposes. The British defied the embargo and ban on the opium trade and encouraged smuggling. As a result, British exports of opium to China grew from an estimated 15 tons to 75 tons by 1773. This increased further to 900 tons by 1820 and to 1,400 tons by 1838, an almost 100-fold increase in 100 years. Something had to be done. The Chinese government introduced the death penalty for drug trafficking and put British processing and distribution facilities on Chinese soil under siege. Chinese troops boarded British ships in international waters carrying opium to Chinese ports and destroyed their cargo, in addition to the destruction of opium found on Chinese territory. The British accused the Chinese of destroying British property and sent a large British Indian army to China in order to exact punishment. British military superiority was clearly evident in the armed conflict. British warships wreaked havoc on coastal towns. After taking Canton, the British sailed up the Yangtze River. They grabbed the tax barges, inflicting a devastating blow on the Chinese as imperial revenues were impossible to collect. In 1842, China sued for peace that was concluded in Nanking and ratified the following year. In the treaty, China was forced to pay an indemnity to Britain, open 4 port cities where British subjects were given extra territorial privileges, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. In 1844, the United States and France signed similar treaties with China. These humiliating treaties were criticized in the House of Commons by William E. Gladstone, who later served as Prime Minister. He was wondering, quote, whether there had ever been a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated to cover Britain with permanent disgrace, end quote. Maybe he should have lived in this century. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, replied that nobody believed that the Chinese government's motive was the promotion of good moral habits, or that the war was fought to stem China's balance of trade deficit. The American President John Quincy Adams chimed in during the debate by suggesting that opium was a mere incident. According to him, the cause of the war was the arrogant and insupportable pretensions of China that she would hold commercial intercourse with the rest of mankind, not upon terms of equal reciprocity, but upon the insulting and degrading forms of the relations between lord and vassal. Does that sound familiar? These words are echoed 160 years later by President Obama's recent disdainful pronouncements to the effect that China's exchange rate policy is unacceptable to the rest of mankind, as it pretends that China's currency is that of the lord and everybody else is that of the vassal. The Peace of Nanking did not last. The Chinese searched a suspicious ship, and the British answered by putting the port city of Canton under siege in 1856, occupying it in 1857. The French also entered the fray. British troops were approaching Beijing and set to destroy the Summer Palace. China again was forced to sue for peace. In the peace treaty of Tianjin, China yielded to the demand to create 10 new port cities and granted foreigners free passage throughout the country. It also agreed to pay an indemnity of 5 million ounces of silver, 3 million to Britain, and 2 million to France. This deliberate humiliation of China by the Western powers contributed greatly to the loosening and ultimate snapping of internal coherence of the Qing dynasty, leading to the Taiping Revolution, the Boxer Uprising, and ultimately the downfall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. Pardon me if I'm not pronouncing these right. The present trade dispute between the U.S. and China is reminiscent of the background of the two Opium Wars. Once more, the issue is the humiliation and plunder of China as a thank you for China's favor of having provided consumer goods for which the West was unable to pay in terms of Western goods suitable for Chinese consumption. The only difference is the absence of opium in the dispute. Oops, I take it back. The role of opium in the current dispute is played by paper dollars to be precise. In 1971, an atrocity was made that I call the Nixon-Friedman conspiracy to cover up the shame and disgrace of the default of the U.S. on its international gold obligations. Milton Friedman, following an earlier failed attempt of John Maynard Keynes, concocted a spurious and idiotic theory of floating exchange rates. It suggests that falling foreign exchange value of the domestic currency makes it stronger when in actual fact the opposite is true. It is made weaker as the terms of trade of the devaluing country deteriorates and that of its trading partners improves. Nixon was quick to embrace the false theory of Friedman. No public debate of the plan was permitted then or ever after. Under the new dispensation, the irredeemable dollar was to play the role of the ultimate extinguisher of debt, a preposterous idea. The scheme was imposed on the world under duress as part of the new millennium, shaking off the tyranny of gold, that barbarous relic, the last remnant of superstition, the only remaining anachronism of the modern age. The ploy was played up and celebrated as a great scientific breakthrough, making it possible for man to shape his own destiny rationally, free of superstition for the first time ever. Yet all it was a cheap trick to elevate the dishonored paper of an insolvent banker, the U.S., from scum to the holy of holies, international currency. The fact that fiat paper money has a history of 100% mortality was neatly sidestepped. Any questioning of the wisdom of experimenting with it in spite of logic and historical evidence was declared foggy, bottom reactionary thinking. The amazing thing about this episode of the history of human folly was the ease with which it could be pushed down the throat of the rest of the world, including those nations that were directly hurt by it, such as the ones running a trade surplus with the U.S. Their savings went up in smoke. The explanation for this self-destructing behavior is the addictive, debilitating, and mind-corrosive nature of paper money, in direct analogy with that of opium. The high caused by administering the opium pipe to the patient, read administering QE, had to be repeated when the effect faded by a fresh administration of more opium, read more QE2. If the patient resists like China did in 1840, then a holy opium war must be declared on it in the name of the right of others to free trade. 170 years later, a new China once more demurred against the paper torture treatment it was subject to by the American debtmongers and opium pushers. But beware. If the West starts another opium war, this time it is not China that will be on the losing side. So, just a fantastic historical explanation, and I just wanted to examine that a little bit. Now, his point is that what happened during this period is very similar to what is happening today. The Chinese were accumulating real money, and they were selling real goods for the money. So at that time it was silver. At other times, actually in the past, I think maybe Marco Polo's time, it was gold. So there's been a history of this, but the Chinese, the Chinese were accumulating real money, and obviously they were intending to do something with it, perhaps invest, who knows. But as Fekete points out, that the Chinese had actually accumulated 9 billion troy ounces. So we don't know how much there was at that time, but I would venture to guess that 9 billion troy ounces of silver was at least 20%, possibly 50%, or even more of all the silver in the world. So you can see under that type of, the world was operating under a modified gold standard, maybe a gold and silver standard, but still, when you have a balance of trade between nations where the metals flow one direction and the goods and services, primarily the goods, flow the other direction, then obviously if the nation that's accumulating the money doesn't purchase things from the nation that is accumulating the goods or using up the goods, there's going to result in a very large imbalance. And that's what we see today. So today we have China and other nations that have a large imbalance, not of silver, but they have a large imbalance of dollars. And they are seeking to use those dollars for something, but they have to find something that they want to buy first. So up until fairly recently, China has been accumulating a large number of dollars. I don't believe that China is continuing to accumulate those dollars. I think China's used most of those that they can on infrastructure, and I think they're trying to surreptitiously accumulate gold again, perhaps accumulate silver again, and certainly secure for themselves the mining and possibly even farming interests of Canada, South America, Africa, and other countries. So it looks like the same thing is heating up again today, but we have Professor Fekete's ominous warning that this time China will not be on the losing side of this game. So it may be that the Chinese have learned from the centuries of abuse that they've suffered from the Western economic powers. And of course, you remember the crime of 1873 when the Western powers decided to demonetize silver. Now that devastated the economy of China. It was just another blow after the many blows, because they had, again, accumulated so much silver that if none of the other countries that had for thousands of years used silver as money, all of a sudden everyone stopped using silver as money, then obviously the person with the most silver is left holding the bag. So again, that's an example of how the Western powers pulled a stunt on China, who has been savers of historical proportions even to today's time. The Chinese, I believe the last figure I heard, save roughly 30 to 40% of their income. If you remember some of the comments out of the administration, I believe Geithner and also Bernanke and even Paulson had mentioned a number of times that the problem with the Chinese is that they save too much. And of course, that's just laughable. Obviously, the problem is not that the Chinese save too much, but the Americans save too little and spend too much. But this is the same sort of thing. So if we're looking for a repeat in the future of this sort of scenario, then what we're going to have to expect is the rules to be suddenly changed again on the Chinese. And so you can speculate on what that may be. My best guess as to what that may be would be possibly some type of universal electronic currency system, where the currency system is no longer based on floating fiat currencies, and it's no longer based on commodities, but it is based on some type of agreed upon rating by some type of universal agency that gives ratings to the various values of countries' currencies, and then brings them into this electronic system. If that were the case, and it were set up by the Western powers all agreeing to do the same thing, that's quite possible that China could be left out again. But I don't think that we want to count Professor Fekete out, that this time it may actually be different. And we'll talk to you next time.